Hi everyone. One of the things that I believe is that everyone has a story, and connected to that is that I believe that no matter who you are, your story is powerful and it's worth sharing and it's worth people listening to. And one of the main reasons why I believe our story, your story, is powerful is because it tells you who you are. And of course, we're always changing and we grow and we mature, but our stories, they shape who we are and who we are becoming. And that's the power of stories. But it's not just your story telling you who you are. There's bigger stories as well. The bigger stories, meta stories in our culture, maybe, which implies that others are also wanting to shape you. If your story shapes you, other people's stories, especially these bigger stories, are also hoping to shape you. That could be the story of our culture, of government, of your boss, of your family, your parents, of marketing companies, and of all these bigger stories. Some are helpful, yeah, for sure, and others less so. And I think that actually God has a story. And I think that God's story tells us who we are meant to be. And actually, more than just who we are meant to be, God's story tells us why we do what we do. And that element of God's story might surprise you. So inside the Bible, which I like to think of as the story of God, inside the story of God, I believe, is the story of us. And the Bible, or God's story, explains the impulse that many of us have to do something about things that we perceive are unjust. Maybe you've seen injustice in the playground, around the neighborhood, in the workplace, or on TV. And there's something inside of you that wants to do something about it. Maybe you do something about it, maybe you don't, but there's something inside of you that wants to do something about it. And that impulse, I call that the prophetic impulse. It's good, and it can cause us, it can be the motivating thing that causes us to stand up to injustice and exploitation. But, as we're soon going to see, if we act on the prophetic impulse in our own strength, it can actually make situations worse. So, looking at the story of God, within the story of God, there's this man called Moses. So we're going to look at the story of Moses. And maybe you remember some of the aspects of the story of Moses, that he was put in a little basket and set afloat in the Nile River, and he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. So remember, what we need to remember is that Moses is a Hebrew. Most of the Hebrew people, the vast majority, 99.9% of the Hebrew people are slaves in Egypt. Moses is a privileged Hebrew, and he was raised in Pharaoh's palace by a princess. So we're going to look at this story of Moses within the Bible, the story of God. So Exodus chapter 2, the second book of the Bible, verse 11 says this. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one on the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. So a critical part in the story of Moses. And so I share that because I believe that God's story says we were all made and created in the image of God. And that part of that image of God inside of us is this prophetic impulse. It's part of our identity. It's part of our identity to, when we see something going wrong, to want to do something about it. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but there's something inside of us that wants to do something. And so when we see someone stand up against an injustice, I think we catch a glimpse of this prophetic impulse. Remember, the story of Moses. Moses has grown up in a privileged context in Egypt, but he reacts to a situation of injustice that he sees towards his fellow Hebrew. And it's very interesting because Moses goes on to be the most famous Hebrew Bible prophet. But before Moses was a prophet, he was a murderer. He saw an act of injustice, an Egyptian slave master kind of giving a hard time to a Hebrew slave. Moses is a privileged Hebrew growing up in an Egyptian palace. but he murders the Egyptian. How's this possible? How is it possible that the most famous prophet in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, starts off life as a murderer? Well, I think there's something interesting here in the story of Moses about who we are and our prophetic identity, the prophetic impulse. Moses is moved because of his prophetic identity. He sees injustice. He wants to do something about it. The prophetic impulse that causes us to react to injustice was operating in Moses. But this is where Moses goes off track. He gets angry in his own strength and tries to fix the problem with his own strength by murdering someone. And I think the story of God, which shows us the story of us through the story of Moses, shows that things go wrong when humans respond to seeing exploitation and injustice and trying to fix things in their own strength, out of their own sense of justice, out of their own ability to do things. So if that's what the story of God is saying, then I think the question is, what is the correct context for the prophetic impulse? Well, let's go to the next chapter in the story of Moses, Exodus chapter 3, and read verses 4 to 14. So maybe just to give you some context, Moses, he flees Egypt after being exposed as a murderer, and he becomes a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years. And so he's gone from the palace to being just an outcast in the wilderness, to being being a shepherd. So verse 4, Exodus chapter 3. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to Israelites. I am has sent me to you." So, after 40 years, Moses, the murderer, has an encounter with God and starts his journey to being Moses, the prophet. The prophetic impulse without an encounter with God can be dangerous. We have these two things, these two stages of Moses' life. Before his encounter with God, after his encounter with God. Before his encounter with God, Moses, the prophetic impulse leads him to murder. After his encounter with God, Moses, his prophetic impulse, sent by God, delivers an entire people out of an exploitative situation, literally a nation of slaves. The prophetic impulse without an encounter with God can be dangerous. But when a prophetic encounter is connected to the prophetic impulse, encountering God, relationship with God, plus the prophetic impulse, that can change the world. Moses had given up on his prophetic impulse and spent 40 years in the desert looking after sheep, but God didn't give up on Moses. He made himself present to Moses and caused him to act on his prophetic impulse in the right way. Moses was to lead the people out of slavery so that they could be free to worship God. Moses was trying to deliver an individual Hebrew from the suffering of one Egyptian slave driver, and he acts on it in his own strength. And then the result is he becomes a murderer. But after encountering with God, Moses delivers the entire nation of Israel out of the slavery from the nation of Egypt so that they could be free to worship God. And God is glorified through that. So Moses' correct context for his prophetic impulse was, I believe, intimacy with God. Moses doesn't just have a momentary encounter with God at the burning bush. Moses actually gains, something deep happens. Moses gains a deeper understanding of who God is, of God's identity, by learning his name at that encounter. Names are important for a relationship. Names mean something for a relationship. I mean, just think about it. You don't have a deeper relationship with just someone you call, hey you, hey champ, hey mate. It's not someone you have a deep relationship with. Names are like the foundation of a deep relationship. And then this encounter, where Moses learns the name of God, leads to more relationship-defining encounters. Later on in the book of Exodus, in chapter 34, in verse 6, on top of the foundation of his name, God reveals his nature. And he reveals his nature as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, but also concerned with justice. And this passage, Exodus 34, verse 6 and verse 7, this is the most referenced passage throughout the Bible. And we can be confident that this is God's posture towards his creation, fully displayed in Jesus. As Moses experiences this encounter with God, he's taking on the same concern for his people and their situation, and is able to more fully bear God's name. Moses has this encounter with God and is able to tell Israel, this is the name of your God. Moses has this further encounter with God and is able to say, this is the nature of our God. We can represent God's name and God's nature to all the broken situations around us. And I think we all have a prophetic impulse inside of us as human beings, as people who carry the image of God, whether we follow Jesus or not. Some of us, I think, have let that prophetic impulse atrophy, kind of shrink down, maybe because it's been beat down by a cynical culture. Or some of us have let the prophetic impulse kind of, on the other end of the spectrum, explode into anger. We've kind of let it die, or we've kind of fed it the wrong way, and we're just angry all the time. But I think there's an invitation in the story of God, which I think includes the story of us. There's an invitation in the story of God to encounter God and let him channel our prophetic impulse to stand up to exploitation in a healthy way. But those are just my thoughts. Love to know what you think. So I've got some questions here. Maybe it provokes some discussion. If your discussion kind of goes off track, then that's fine. I think it's just important to get a conversation going. So maybe these can help. First set of questions. Where do you see the prophetic impulse at work in our society today? In good ways and maybe in not so good ways? Where do you see people going, kind of standing up and showing that things aren't right and they need to be fixed? Can you remember personally a time when you saw something unjust and felt that kind of inside of you, this isn't right? And what did you do with that? And why do you think humans have this instinct to react to injustice? Moses, second group of questions here. Moses himself acts against injustice before his encounter with God, but he does it through violence. Why do you think his response made things worse instead of better? It doesn't might make right. Have you ever actually acted out of anger? Maybe you can relate to Moses. Have you ever acted out of anger for something good, but then later realized your approach wasn't healthy? And what happened? Final group of questions. Do you agree that the right context for the prophetic impulse is intimacy with God? Maybe you don't. Maybe you think, no, that's wrong. Love to hear your ideas. How might time with God, getting to know him better, how might that reshape our anger, our passion, or desire to fix things? Maybe in a more healthy way, perhaps. And then finally, what's the difference between being driven by outrage and being sent by God? Is there a difference? What do you think? Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully we can have some fruitful discussion from this, and I'd love to hear your ideas. Thanks guys.